Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome back to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. We have got quite the episode to get through tonight. If I'm completely honest, it isn't exactly the episode that I set out to make when I first started with this one, but I let the truth kind of lead me in this rather than trying to direct the narrative. And I think that in the end, you will definitely learn a lot, and hopefully be entertained, at least by some of it, particularly if this subject matter is something that you find interesting. This is the culmination of weeks of research and writing. Happy with what we ended up with here, but again, it wasn't the episode that I really set out to make. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the end, but I just want to jump on here real quick and welcome everyone. I really appreciate you joining us and for coming back this week. I don't want to talk too much right here at the beginning just because we have quite a bit to get through again. If you have very short attention spans or are not interested at all in the life of Nikola Tesla, I'm going to go ahead and tell you probably either want to skip this one or go 35, maybe 45 minutes into this one before you're really going to feel compelled by it. But I feel like the more that I learned, because I thought I knew pretty much the story of Tesla and how everything happened, and I thought I understood it a lot better than I did. Through all the research, I continued to learn things that I had no idea about, and I found those things particularly interesting because he's a character that I've always found fascinating personally. So I thought others might as well, and in writing the background, it kind of became more of the story than I ever intended. It's definitely something that I think will fascinate you. Again, if you're into this kind of subject matter, pretty compelling evidence that I've come across that I'm very excited to bring you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this week's prelude. Just after midnight, the fall of 1937 in New York City, Nikola Tesla left his then home in the New Yorker hotel, headed toward the library and to St. John's Cathedral. These were frequent trips that he would make on a near nightly basis. But on this particular night, however, he wouldn't make it to his destination, as he was struck by a speeding taxicab and thrown to the ground. Very little seems to be actually known about the incident itself, aside from the fact that it did damage his back and broke 3 of his ribs at least. However, the then 81-year-old Tesla refused to seek medical assistance, and that was kind of his custom, to be honest, and instead just dusted himself off and returned to his room at the New Yorker hotel unassisted. While it is frequently said that this was his downfall, one he never recovered and led to his death, Tesla would quickly go back to his usual routine, which would continue for another 5 years, until January 7th, 1943. Then at the age of 86, Tesla would be found by hotel maid Alice Monahan, fully dressed, laying on his bed deceased. This is far from the whole story, though, and tonight we will endeavor to piece together the incredible life and mysterious death of one of, if not the greatest inventors the world has ever seen. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, Death Rays and Destiny, the mysterious life and death of Nikola Tesla. Part 1. Who was Nikola Tesla? If I were to ask most people who was responsible for the electricity that is powering their home, I'm sure most people would probably say Thomas Edison. It's an easy answer, right? Sure, but still kind of wrong. Edison is the accredited creator of DC, or direct current form of transmitting power, and using electrical current for a lot of these things, but this too isn't really correct. Honestly, Italian physicist Alessandro Volta was actually the first person to do this with his early electric battery called the voltaic pile, and first published his experiments in 1799. I could actually go on a very long rant here about the vast majority of Edison's quote inventions, but that's not why you tuned in, now is it? If you're truly curious though, leave it in the Q&A or on the Spotify page. Might include it in next week's BTR. The power that flows into your home today isn't actually DC current at all. It's transmitted as AC, or alternating current, because AC is easier to generate, to transmit, easier to convert to higher or lower voltages, costs less to generate and to transmit. Pretty hard to tell these days though, am I right? But perhaps most importantly, it's much safer than DC. And you can thank Nikola Tesla for that. Okay, so let's try another easy one, shall we? What if I were to ask who invented the radio? Well, that's another easy one, right? It was Marconi, of course. Well, sorry, that too is not exactly correct. Electromagnetic waves, including radio waves, were actually discovered in the 1880s by Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, who first pioneered techniques to study them. The story is typically told that Marconi built the first radio for long-range communication after reading about the work of Hertz, and built on those techniques. While Marconi did technically invent the radio, sort of, it's actually a very long and highly convoluted story, and nowhere near as cut and dry as we were all told. It also varies by source, as this all happened in the late 1800s to the very start of the 20th century and involved people all over the world working towards its creation. What I can tell you, with a high degree of certainty, is that Marconi didn't just read about the work of Hertz for his inspiration. It was the work of Tesla that first made him realize that wireless transmission with radio waves was possible, because Tesla had already been demonstrating it since around 1890. So when Marconi first filed for a US patent for the radio technology in 1900, he was turned away because it was too closely resembling the work of Tesla, who had filed for the first US radio patent in 1897. While Marconi did file for the wireless telegraph patent in 1896 in England, what he invented was a two-current system that could hardly transmit across a wide street or a pond. While Tesla had the ability to transmit at least 50 miles in 1895. However, Tesla would also suffer a disaster that same year when a fire at his lab would cause him to lose all of his work. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit here. Marconi, who had ties to the English aristocracy, began using a Tesla-invented oscillator to boost his device's range, as well as a series of political maneuvering, and pulled strings to give his wireless telegraph company a big boost in the stock market, along with financial assistance from Thomas Edison. Yes, there's a recurring theme here, but we will get to that. And using his powerful backers would convince the patent office to reverse its original decision and award Marconi the patent in 1904, despite his device having allegedly used 17 of Tesla's patents that he had created. However, in 1943, shortly after Tesla's death, the U.S. Supreme Court would vote to uphold Tesla's radio patent, making him the inventor of radio. For the record, though, the Supreme Court didn't just decided they were going to right their wrong to do the right thing. They did it because the Marconi Company was suing the U.S. government for use of its patents in World War I. So they avoided that lawsuit by restoring the priority of Tesla's patent over Marconi's. This is just a small sample of the many times Tesla's work was stolen or went uncredited due to greedier or more ambitious men. To better understand the story I have for you tonight, first it's important to go back to the very beginning and try to understand exactly who was Nikola Tesla. Close after midnight on July 10, 1856, during what was said to be a uniquely powerful lightning storm, Nikola Tesla was born in the village of Smiljan within the military frontier of the Austrian Empire, or what is present-day Croatia, to a priest father and a mother with no formal education, but was said to be exceptionally talented at crafting tools and mechanical appliances. He was the fourth of 5 children. He would complete primary school in Smiljan and study German, arithmetic, and religion. He would later move to Karlovac, where he would attend high school at the Higher Real Gymnasium, being inspired by his physics professor, whose demonstrations of the mysterious phenomenon, quote-unquote, would, in Tesla's words, make him want to know more of this wonderful force. Able to perform complex calculations in his head caused some of his teachers to believe that he had to be somehow cheating, but it would aid him in completing a 4-year term in only 3 years. After graduation, Tesla would return to Smiljan with intentions of following his father's wishes of entering the priesthood, as his father had. Cholera, however, would have other plans for him, as upon catching it, he would remain bedridden for 9 months, almost dying several times. In a moment of desperation, it said his father would promise to send him to the best engineering school available if he was able to just recover from his sickness. Luckily for all of us, he would do so. Well, a year later, he would avoid conscription into the Austrian-Hungarian army by taking off to Tommingaye. I'm sorry, these Serbian words are a bit difficult. Where he would explore the mountains, dressed in a hunting garb, and Tesla would say that this experience in nature would make him stronger both mentally and physically. And he credited the readings of works of Mark Twain as helping him to fully recover. In 1875, he would enroll at the Imperial Royal Technical College in Graz, where he would pass almost twice the required number of exams, but by his 3rd year, he found himself distracted and would never actually fully graduate. He would reportedly not return home after this, but was eventually tracked down by his father shortly before his death in April 1879. Skipping ahead slightly to January of 1880, 2 of Tesla's uncles would put together enough money to send him to Prague in hopes of studying at Charles Ferdinand University. However, he would miss the enrollment period and instead would just audit classes on philosophy. After this, he would relocate to Budapest, Hungary in 1881, where he would work and help to improve the telephone exchange as the chief electrician before moving to Paris in 1882, where his life's ambitions would finally begin to truly form when he got a position with the Continental Edison Company in the brand new industry of installing indoor incandescent lighting citywide. Here he would gain valuable practical experience in the field of electrical engineering. Here he would also quickly catch the eye of his supervisors, who would soon have him designing and building improved versions of generating dynamos, which are really just a type of generator, as well as improving and creating new types of motors. It was here, while on assignment in Strasbourg, while working after hours, that he constructed his first induction motor. He would gain a lot of knowledge throughout his work during this time and impressed many of the higher-ups in the company. One of these higher-ups was a man named Charles Batchelor, whom, after overseeing the Paris installation where Tesla was working, would in 1884 be brought back to the U.S. to manage Edison Machine Works, a manufacturing division located in New York City. It would be Mr. Batchelor who would be the catalyst for Tesla to come to New York, as well as he asked that Tesla join him there. So in June of 1884, at the age of 23, Tesla would set sail for America, a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of virtually everyone else in the world over. Tesla would arrive in New York and almost immediately start work at the Machine Works in Manhattan, in a notoriously overcrowded shop full of several hundred machinists, laborers, as well as managing staff, and at least 20 field engineers whose difficult job it was to build the large electric utility in the city. To start, Tesla was essentially tasked with the same job as he was doing in Paris, working on troubleshooting and improving generators. This would, however, lead to the first of several encounters that he would have with company founder Thomas Edison. One of note would occur when, after working all night repairing a damaged dynamos on the ocean liner the SS Oregon, Tesla would run into Edison and Batchelor. Edison would allegedly joke about how their Parisian must have been out all night. Tesla would respond with how he had actually been up all night fixing the Oregon, leading Edison to comment to Batchelor, "This is a damned good man." Unfortunately, their cordial rapport would soon turn into a bitter rivalry that would lead to what would later be known as the War of the Currents. Before this, however, he would continue to impress Edison and gain his respect. The exact reason that Tesla would leave Edison Machine Works isn't truly clear, but it is believed to have been over unpaid bonuses he felt he had earned. A common story that is told, including by Tesla himself, is that the manager of the Machine Works offered a $50,000 bonus if he could design 24 different types of standard machines, which Tesla supposedly did, only to find out that it was a, quote, practical joke. Later iterations of the story have Edison himself making the offer and then refusing to pay by telling Tesla, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." There really remains no concrete proof of either story, though. It's often repeated. The amount of the bonuses have been noted as a bit odd, considering it would be the equivalent of nearly $2 million in today's economy, an amount that notoriously low-paying and frequently considered stingy with pay Machine Works wouldn't have had on hand, nor would anyone believe they would ever offer, even in jest. Tesla's own diary doesn't offer any real insight into his motivations to actually leave the company, aside from a note that's scrawled across the 2 pages from 7th December 1884 to 4th of January 1885, that's simply stating, quote, "Goodbye to Edison Machine Works," end quote. Upon leaving Edison Machine Works, Tesla would begin working on a patented arc lighting system, possibly the same one he had first developed at Edison, and would, in March of 1885, meet with patent attorney Lemuel Sorel, who was the same attorney used by Edison and who would assist him in submitting the patents for the lighting system. He would also introduce Tesla to 2 businessmen, Robert Lane and Benjamin Vail, who would go on to finance an arc lighting manufacturing and utility company, and the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing Company was born. Tesla would spend the rest of 1885 obtaining patents, including for improved DC generators, his first U.S. patent, as well as building and installing his improved system in Rahway, New Jersey, gaining him praise within the technical press for its advanced features. Unfortunately, his investors showed no real interest in his ideas for new types of alternating currents, however, so once the utility was up and functioning in New Jersey in 1886, they opted to get out of the highly competitive manufacturing side of the business and instead focus on simply running as a utility company. Also, unfortunately, was that they chose to do so without Tesla, abandoning his electric light manufacturing company completely, leaving him broken and penniless. Having taken a stock option on his patents and assigning them to the company in exchange for it, he also lost those. This forced Tesla to work odd jobs, including digging ditches just to survive. It's safe to say at this point, Tesla felt all his work and education had been for nothing. From these difficult times, Tesla would only grow more determined. In the late fall of 1886, he would meet with 2 other businessmen experienced in setting up companies and promoting inventions, Alfred S. Brown, a superintendent with Western Union, and Anthony Charles Fletcher Peck. Together, this trio would form the Tesla Electric Company in April of 1887. They would reach an agreement on a 3-way split of profits from his patents, with 1/3 to Tesla, half to Brown and Peck, and 1/3 to go back into fund further development. The pair would also set up Tesla with his first major laboratory, located at 89 Liberty Street in Manhattan. It would be here that Tesla developed fully the induction motor that ran on alternating current. It involved a polyphase current that generated a rotating magnetic field to turn the motor, a novel invention that would be patented in May of 1888. Aside from helping Tesla patent this motor, they also set out to help him promote it. One stop along that journey was in May of 1888 at the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, where engineers employed by Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, who was already a major player in the rapidly growing and fiercely competitive industry of electrical utilities and equipment manufacturing, would be blown away by Tesla's work and report back to none other than George Westinghouse himself that someone had demonstrated a viable AC motor and systems to use it. This was the missing piece of the puzzle for Westinghouse, who was seeking to dominate the electric company market and wrestle it away from Edison. He had previously been looking into a similar system developed between 1885 and 1888 by Italian physicist Galileo Ferraris. But after finding out about Tesla, he decided his patent would be more viable and could likely control the market. So, in July of 1888, Brown and Peck began negotiations for a licensing deal with Westinghouse for use of Tesla's polyphase induction motor. He would go on to hire Tesla as a consultant for 1 year at his Petersburg labs. This would come at a pivotal time, as what would become known as the War of the Currents was about to begin. Part 2. The War of the Currents. I know there was a bit of a long-winded intro to Tesla, and trust me, there is still plenty that I left out on that part, just for the sake of pacing. But all of those events would have a part in not only what was to come next, but set the trajectory for what would become Tesla's legacy, and ultimately his demise. Before I get too far ahead of myself again though, let's jump back into the year of 1888 for a bit longer as the intense competition between the three biggest players in the electric company market were starting to reach a boiling point. There were three main companies competing for the lion's share of profits in this capital-intense industry. We've already met two of them in Edison and Westinghouse, but another growing contender was that of Thomas Houston Electric Company, each one battling it out and undercutting one another's bids for lighting and electrical contracts, both here and abroad. Edison and Westinghouse had been duking it out over the lighting game for a while now, but Thomas Houston had their eyes set on becoming a major competitor as well in the power game. Edison had dominated the market since its inception, and largely through the work of others, for the record, had for the most part pioneered the DC electrical industry in so many ways, especially in the US, and sensing that his throne was in danger, Edison would launch into a heavily funded smear campaign against alternating current, and in 1888 would begin publicly claiming that high voltages used in AC systems were hazardous, and the design was inferior to and infringed upon the patents behind DC power. Edison would take things much further than this, however, by colluding with Harold P. Brown, a New York electrical engineer and an outspoken critic of AC power. Brown would claim that the AC-based lighting companies, like Westinghouse, were putting the public at risk by using high-voltage systems, and their installations were inferior, which made them much more dangerous. The pair would work together to drag AC through the mud, so to speak, going as far as publicly electrocuting animals, with technical assistance and power provided by Edison, of course, in a bid to scare the uninformed public away from using AC power. Anything from stray dogs to an elephant named Topsy, quick moment of silence please for Topsy, R.I.P. Topsy, were all fair game in this disgusting and disingenuous ploy to maintain the monopoly and to put AC out of business. They would also collude with Westinghouse chief rival, the Thomas Houston Electric Company, to ensure the first electric chair was powered by a Westinghouse AC generator, which actually resulted in a botched attempt. Initially, a 17-second administration was delivered to the subject, a mentally disabled man by the name of William Kimbler, and he was pronounced dead. That is, until he let out a deep groan, and the cry to "turn on the current" was shouted by witnesses, which led to a grueling 2 minutes until the chamber began to fill with the smell of burning flesh. 2 people in attendance passed out at this point, and many others began vomiting. Side note, I wouldn't have wanted to be witness to this torturous and horrible sounding execution, but I would actually love to have seen the crowd's reaction to it. Maybe I'm a little twisted, but something about the thought of a room full of prim and proper New York socialites clutching their pearls before falling over in the floor or bursting into fits of collective vomiting admittedly does make me chuckle a little bit. Anyway, from slander to murder, Edison refused to lose this war. By the early 1890s, the war was coming to a close, and a merger between Edison Electric and Thomas Houston would create General Electric in 1892, and they would now control 3/4 of the U.S. electrical business. While this would deal a major blow to Westinghouse's bottom line, good things were still happening for them. In 1893, Westinghouse would win the bid to light the World's Fair in Chicago, called the World's Columbian Exposition, to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival. I vehemently refuse to credit him with discovering anything, but I will say his arrival to the Americas. And later that year, they would also secure the major part of the contract to build Niagara Falls hydroelectric power station project, splitting the remainder of the contract with General Electric. Edison had left the company after losing his majority control in the 1892 merger, and subsequently left the electrical business altogether to pursue other endeavors. Westinghouse suffered his own troubles throughout the affair, especially after the near collapse of Barings Bank in London sparked the financial panic of 1890, which triggered investors to call in their loans to Westinghouse Electric. This set off a chain reaction of refinancing and new lenders who insisted on cutbacks on spending. Among those was the per-motor royalty in Tesla's contract, a motor which at this point was largely unsuccessful, and Westinghouse was still paying a $15,000 a year guaranteed royalty, despite the fact that working examples of the motor were rare, and the polyphase power systems required to make it actually work were even more of a rare thing. Tesla would negotiate releasing the company from the royalty clause in order to keep them promoting its use. This would last for 6 years until Westinghouse would purchase the patent outright for a lump sum of $216,000, in conjunction with General Electric, who had entered into a patent-sharing agreement with Westinghouse. This move would make Tesla truly independently wealthy for the first time in his life. In 1889, Tesla would leave his Liberty Street laboratory and pursue his own interests. Working from a series of different workshops across Manhattan, he would hire a staff and begin to work on some of his greatest inventions. Part 3. The Rise and Fall of Nikola Tesla. It was in the summer of 1889 things started to truly take off regarding Tesla's inventions. This all started when he would travel to Paris for the 1889 Expo Universelle, and would first learn of Hertz's experiments proving electromagnetic radiation, including radio waves. Tesla would return to New York with a mind awakened to new possibilities. His first major experiment was to attempt to power a Ruhmkorff coil with a high-speed alternator he had been working on for use in his lighting systems, but found that it was overheating the iron core and melting the insulation between the wires. Instead, Tesla would develop an oscillating transformer using air rather than a physical insulation and a movable core, and with those modifications, what would come to be known as the Tesla coil was born. Later, this becomes a key element in his wireless power work. Starting in 1890, Tesla would start working on something that would become synonymous with the inventor, and I'm sure many of you familiar with him may have seen this demonstration, but it was lighting bulbs he would simply hold in his hands or from across a stage by inductive and capacitive coupling using high voltage AC generated with the coil. While highly impressive to witness, particularly to crowds in the late 1800s, he probably looked like a freaking wizard, he would never succeed on producing a wireless lighting system for commercial use. The Tesla coil, however, would live on. Then, on July 30th, 1891, at the age of 35, Tesla would reach a milestone when he was granted naturalized citizenship, and another later that same year when he would officially patent his Tesla coil invention. By the start of 1893, two of Westinghouse's engineers had cracked the code, so to speak, with how to make Tesla's polyphase induction motor system compatible with older single-phase AC and DC systems when they developed a rotary converter. I've tried not to bog us down too much with technical jargon, but essentially it's just a device that could convert AC to DC for the first time, and it was able to, make it more universally viable. It could be used in a lot more settings. This would give Westinghouse the thing he needed most, a way to provide electricity to all potential customers with AC or DC systems. They would brand it the Tesla Polyphase System. While I skipped ahead a bit for the sake of wrapping up the War of the Currents earlier, this would also be the year that Westinghouse Electric would invite Tesla to participate in the 1893 World Fair and would secure the bid to provide the lighting of the event. This would serve for many their first true introduction to AC beyond the negative propaganda and would demonstrate the safety, reliability, efficiency, and capability that alternating current could provide. Westinghouse would set up a demonstration space in what would be called the quote, electricity building, which was entirely devoted to displaying the wonders of electricity. Within this attraction was a large space dedicated to displaying various models of Tesla's induction motor, including a demonstration to show the workings and abilities of a rotating magnetic field. One such demo was called the Egg of Columbus. You have to remember, this fair was themed in celebration of Columbus and all that, where they would use the two-phase coil from an induction motor to spin a copper egg, making it stand on its end without any supports. Which, let's be honest, had to be pretty freaking mind-blowing in 1893. The fair would last for 6 months, of which Tesla would spend 1 week there to visit the International Electric Congress, which were a series of worldwide meetings to basically discuss the field of applied electricity and to establish formal measurements. This is a volt, this is an ohm, things like that. That went on for a long time. This was just one of many meetings. Tesla would also put on several demonstrations at the Westinghouse exhibit. If you recall, this is also the year that Westinghouse would win the majority bid for the Niagara Power Plant, which was won in great part at least due to the head of the Niagara Falls Construction Company being so impressed by the demonstrations of the World's Fair that he asked Tesla to consult with him on which system would best transmit the power generated by the falls. That man's name was Edward Dean Adams. He would later tour Tesla's New York lab in 1895 and be so impressed with that he would agree to help found the Nikola Tesla Company, which would handle all of Tesla's patents for decades to come after. Part 4. Disaster strikes the first time. Tesla was making incredible strides towards many new inventions during this time, and things appeared to be smooth sailing finally. That is until the wee hours of the morning of March 13, 1895, when his lab at 5th Avenue burned to the ground. The fire was actually so intense that despite it starting in the basement, it would grow so severe it would not only reach Tesla's 4th floor lab, but it would burn it so completely that the thing would collapse down into the 2nd floor, destroying all of his ongoing projects, as well as much of his notes and his research materials at the time, including work he had began in 1894 into invisible radiant energy, experimenting with Crookes tubes. Without dragging you through more technical jargon here, there is a very good chance that had his lab not been destroyed, he would have been also credited with the discovery of X-rays. He would, however, still go on to do work in that field. From his new lab in New York, Tesla would begin to work on his next major invention, one he would demonstrate to the public during an exhibition at Madison Square Garden in 1898. Having been for a long time fascinated by the automatons he had seen, which were essentially the first robots in a lot of ways, and they date back all the way to ancient Egypt really, he dreamt of a way to control things of this nature remotely. And if you've ever changed the channel on your TV from the comfort of your couch, then you technically have Tesla to thank for that, as well as his next invention, which he dubbed teleautomation. or as we call it today, of course, remote control. While he certainly wowed the crowd of onlookers that rainy September day with this seemingly autonomous boat that he was actually able to control with a radio signal emitting box that was tuned to receivers and would trigger lights, a rudder, a propeller, based all on signals it received, the underlying technology he first developed would go on to shape the world as we know it. The basic premise of how his remote control boat operated was a method for encoding and decoding Hertzian waves, toggling different actions based on different signals, or essentially what we would consider today to be a logic gate. That's a term that should be familiar to my fellow computer nerds out there, but for everyone else, it's essentially just the first steps of and or logic gate operations, which are like the building blocks from which all modern computers draw from as the base of their processing. It's been widely publicized that Tesla would pitch the use of this to the military, who were supposedly uninterested at the time. His true vision for the device was in the field of robotics, something that was many years at that point from being even conceived by anyone else. From the 1890s up until at least 1906, Tesla would focus in and spend much of his time, as well as his money, trying to develop a globally scalable means of wireless power transmission. But his vision wasn't only to transmit power, but also worldwide communication, since at that time there still wasn't any feasible way to transmit communication signals across long distances, and certainly not power. He began working on a way to use the Earth itself, or the atmosphere, to accomplish this, concepts that sounded like science fiction at the time. This was, however, what Tesla excelled at the most, envisioning things that seemed impossible and making them work somehow. In 1899, Tesla would travel to Colorado Springs to set up an experimental station to further study low-pressure air at a higher altitude, and have the ability to use much larger coils than he could within the somewhat cramped confines of his New York labs. Here, he would make what was arguably his most important discovery: terrestrial stationary waves. With this discovery, he proved that the very Earth itself could be used as a conductor and could be made to resonate at certain electrical frequencies. Here, he was also able to light 200 lamps without the use of wires from a distance of 25 miles, as well as created man-made lightning, which produced flashes measuring 41 meters or 135 feet. He would also begin observing unusual signals from his lab's receiver. Ones he would speculate could be coming from another planet within the solar system. He would make the mistake of mentioning this in a letter to a reporter, and again to the Red Cross Society, causing reporters to, of course, jump onto it and sensationalize the story, by, of course, jumping to the conclusion that Tesla was hearing signals from Mars. Mars had been a major focus of early sci-fi and was still very much a popular subject within the zeitgeist at the time, so Mars it was. He would later expand on his thoughts during an interview with the Collier's Weekly, explaining these signals weren't immediately apparent to be intelligently controlled signals, and could have come from several different planets. Theories still abound as to the origins of these signals. The Black Knight satellite is subject to discussion, which we will get more into later this season. The signal emitted by Saturn, all the way to more earthly sources, such as other early experiments in wireless transmission. I've also heard it said that one of Jupiter's moons is the most likely origin point for where that signal was coming from. Regardless, his work in Colorado Springs would reinvigorate the inventor, now determined that wireless transmission of not only electricity, but so much more was possible, and within his grasp. And with that, Tesla would soon return to New York to seek further funding for his ambitious plans. Which brings us to part 5. Disaster strikes again. Wardenclyffe. In a career marked by incredible triumphs and crushing defeats, Tesla was unknowingly racing towards an epic crescendo to both of those. With what remained of his fortune, Tesla would travel back to New York in January of 1900 and begin an onslaught of wining and dining the city's social elites in search of investors for his next endeavor, In March of 1901, he would succeed in this goal by exchanging 51% of his patent rights in telephony and telegraphy, as well as any that would be produced during their work together, to none other than J.P. Morgan. Yes, that J.P. Morgan, for a sum of $150,000, or what today would be around $5.5 million. With this money, he would secure land in Shoreham, New York, on the north shore of Long Island, and begin planning the construction of his most ambitious facility, Wardenclyffe Tower. Much of the reason J.P. Morgan decided to finance Tesla was that Tesla's system of wireless transmission was said by Tesla, at least, to be vastly superior and based on patents that superseded those of Marconi and the other wireless inventors, and that he assured Morgan would far outpace the performance of its primary competition, which was the transatlantic telegraph cable. Morgan wasn't interested in providing free wireless electricity, but a system that would possibly give him a leg up in the new industry of communications technologies. Now, that sounded like another market he could potentially corner. At the same time, Tesla was signing a contract and beginning work on the wireless station at Wardenclyffe. His number one competitor, Marconi, was figuring out how to send radio signals beyond the range that most physicists believed could be achieved. Tesla would read a description of the device which described it as using a, quote, Tesla coil connected to the Earth, and this would make him believe that Marconi was copying his Earth resonance system to achieve it. Tesla would decide he needed to scale up his designs and use a much more powerful transmitter in an attempt to outdo Marconi at his own game, as well as to push forward with his ideas of incorporating advanced telephone, image, and power transmission. Yes, you heard that right. Tesla, ever the visionary, was working on ways to send photographs wirelessly back at the turn of the last century. To achieve all of this, however, he would need more money, and upon explaining his intentions to Morgan, not only was he refused, but Morgan demanded an accounting of what money had been spent. Despite the lack of funding, Tesla would continue to push forward with the project. In July of 1901, Tesla would close a contract for the construction of his wireless telegraph plant and electrical laboratory. I'm sure most of you have probably seen pictures of the tower and building below it, but it was a 186-foot, or 57 meters for my UK listeners, and a spherical-shaped cupola at the top. Tesla tried hard to keep most of the details of the construction away from the prying eyes of the public, no doubt fearing another of his ideas may be stolen, particularly the area beneath the tower. In later testimony, however, details would emerge that he also had built a 10-foot by 12-foot steel-lined shaft going 120 feet, or 37 meters, into the ground below the tower, complete with a staircase. There also were 16 iron pipes at the bottom, driven 300 feet into the earth, in order to, in his own words, quote, to have a grip on the earth so that the whole of this globe can quiver. He was a bit of a dramatic guy, and that's probably why the newspapers loved him so much. There were also brick-lined tunnels running all throughout the grounds. I'll spare you all the details of how this thing was designed to function. I'm sure I've bored all of you enough at this point with the sciencey bits, but it was a hell of a contraption that he had dreamt up, and it was to be powered by a coal-fired 200 kilowatt Westinghouse AC industrial generator. By September of 1901, construction was underway, but money was already running short. Morgan still hadn't paid Tesla the remainder of the amount that he had promised, and Tesla would write letter after letter to Morgan, asking for the money and giving him assurances that the system would be far superior to what Marconi was doing. Morgan would seemingly ignore these letters, in Tesla's eyes at least. Here's when the story gets a little bit more interesting. I'm sure some of you are probably thinking, thank God for that, it's about time. Sorry, I just felt it was important to give at least, I assure you, was a very abbreviated history of who this man was and some of the many inventions and over 300 patents he was responsible for creating. The standard documented reason we often hear for why Morgan did this and refused to continue funding it is because Tesla breached their contract and built a tower twice as large as Morgan agreed to, which is also why he ran out of money so fast. and Tesla was actually asking for more money while making expansions that weren't agreed to by his primary investor. Typically, most of what you will read will give you that explanation and narrative, and as usual with stories that we discussed here, the truth and the narrative we've been told are not always exactly the same thing. While history is very black and white and tends to side with the victor, real life tends to be a bit more nuanced than that. There's also a contention of biographers who have asserted that Morgan pulled the funding when he realized Tesla intended to beam electricity wirelessly around the world, and so the financially motivated Morgan pulled his funding believing that free wireless energy wouldn't be profitable, putting greed as the top reason that Wardenclyffe failed. As usual though, the real truth likely lies somewhere in between. One of the biggest reasons I've found, and seemingly the only consistent thread, is that in December of 1901, as money was running low, Marconi would announce to the world that he was able to send a signal across the Atlantic in the form of the Morse code letter S. He would also send another signal in the form that Marconi had already seemingly achieved what Tesla still hadn't proven any success of. And in a time of economic uncertainty, as well as market panics, he appeared to be the safer bet for investors. You will often hear that J.P. Morgan also blocked funding from other investors and his fellow socialites, which is easily believable, and while there seems to be some evidence of this, it's equally likely that he did so to prevent them from losing money as he had at that point, and on what appeared to be a bad investment. What is for sure is that construction would labor on until 1902 and through that year, but the full scope of the project was never completed. Tesla needed more funds. Investors weren't interested in his expensive and unproven plans, and Morgan wasn't budging. In 1903, on July 3rd, Tesla would write Morgan once again pleading, "Will you help me, or let my great work, almost complete, go to pots?" Morgan would reply on July 14th, simply saying, quote, "I have received your letter, and in reply would say that I should feel disposed at present to make any further advances." End quote. The night Tesla received this message, and for several nights after, multiple newspapers would report that Wardenclyffe Tower would come alive with the crackle of lightning and bright flashes lit up the night sky. Long story slightly shorter at least, he would never receive the funding needed to continue his pursuit. Tesla would struggle on. In May 1905, his patents for the AC motor would expire, bringing an end to the royalties that were largely keeping him and the project afloat at that time. In 1906, immense financial woes and bad luck, including a suspected mental breakdown, Tesla would be forced to abandon his beloved Wardenclyffe. Investors and even the press had turned on him, and his debts became insurmountable. The property would be foreclosed on by 1915, and in 1917, demolition would begin with the tower in order for it to be broken down and sold as scrap to repay the land debts. So, not with a bang, but with a decided whimper, Tesla's overly ambitious project at Wardenclyffe would come to an anticlimactic end. Before we get into the death ray, or his unusual death, I just want to quickly sum up a few things about Tesla. He only allowed himself a few real friends in his life, one of them being Mark Twain, who is thought to have actually been the person he was photographing when the first real X-ray was taken on accident. He was notoriously bad with money, and only really saw it as a means to create what he envisioned. In his personal life, he was an eccentric man. He was driven by compulsions, and suffered from an ever-progressing germophobia. He was also brilliant, could fully envision designs and test them in his head, and had an intuition that allowed him to seemingly just sense hidden scientific secrets, as well as theories, and had enough knowledge and inventive talent to frequently prove those. He was also a constant gift to reporters who were always looking for something sensational to cover, and a worry to their editors unsure of how his futuristic-sounding ideas would be regarded. Tesla lived an interesting life, one with many ups and downs in equal measure, and in the end, he changed the way our world works today for the better. Part 6. The Latter Years, the Death Ray, and Other Inventions. Upon the closure of Wardenclyffe, a dejected and defeated and nearly broke Tesla would return to New York City, and opened an office at 165 Broadway in Manhattan in hopes of developing and marketing his patents one last time. He would go on to open and close several other offices, typically over money troubles. By the time he finally settled at 8 West 40th Street, he was basically bankrupt. Virtually all of his patents had expired, royalties dried up left and right, and he was struggling to find the stability he needed to finish his new inventions. On his birthday at age 50, he would unveil a 200 horsepower, 151 kilowatt, bladeless turbine. He would try to perfect the Tesla turbine for many years, with mostly little success, but would eventually license the idea to a precision instrument company where it would somehow find use in the luxury car market in the form of speedometers and other instruments. Tesla's money problems would persist, however, and soon he would find himself moving from hotel to hotel across New York, running up sizable bills before moving on to a new one. He would also begin feeding and nursing the city's pigeons back to health about this time, and according to him, communicating with them. His eccentric behavior would worsen over the years, but he would continue to work on inventions. Tesla would move to his final residence at the Hotel New Yorker in 1934. Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing, perhaps worried about the bad press regarding the impoverished conditions that their once top inventor found himself in, or perhaps out of a sense of owing him for all he had done for the company. Either way, they began paying him $125, or what would roughly be $3,000 in today's ridiculously inflated economy, per month, along with paying his rent at the hotel. There are several varying accounts as to why this was, but those two seem to be the most consistent ones that I've found. Either way, this would continue until his death. Tesla and a journalist named Kenneth M. Sweezy would organize and throw lavish parties that Sweezy started and that Tesla would make a yearly event. Many journalists and significant figures would attend to congratulate Tesla, including Albert Einstein, who was always pretty impressed with Tesla's genius. He would frequently address the crowd to tell them of his newest inventions, including in 1932 when he announced that he had invented a motor that would run on cosmic rays, and in 1934 when he would first reveal to reporters that he had designed a superweapon with the intention of ending all war by making it virtually impossible. He called this weapon Teleforce, but it would become to be known as his death ray. In 1940, the New York Times reported that the weapon was to have a range of 250 miles, 400 kilometers, and would cost an expected $2 million, or around $42 million today, to develop. Tesla would seek out investors from the U.S. War Department, UK, Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. Germany, however, would also be very interested in this design. The term ray isn't exactly correct, as according to many sources, including plans that would later surface in 1984 in a museum in Belgrade, indicate this was actually a particle beam weapon that Tesla was describing. Bear that in mind for later. Starting in the late 1920s, Tesla would form a friendship with George Virich, a German poet and mystic whom he would later supposedly speak to regarding many inventions, including his death ray. Virich would, many years later, be exposed as having been on Hitler's payroll. In 1935, Tesla would, according to the FBI, sell preliminary, incomplete plans of his death ray to the Soviets for $25,000 in 1935, or roughly $592,287 or so today. Which brings us back to that fall in 1937, when he was hit by a cab, and some say he would become progressively more paranoid from this point. Tesla would rarely be seen publicly after this, spending much of his time caring for his pigeons and inventing in private. Until, at age 86, he would be found dead in his hotel room on January 7, 1943, from what was ruled to be a pulmonary thrombosis, which is a type of heart attack. While I can't make any assertions with any degree of certainty, and I'm not saying this is what happened by any stretch of the imagination, I do feel it's pertinent to at least point out that at this time the CIA had just finished developing their shellfish toxin-powered, virtually silent heart attack gun capable of triggering a heart attack and leaving no traces aside from a very small entry wound that could easily be mistaken or even completely missed during an autopsy. Immediately following Tesla's death, a safe-cracking raid would be undertaken by the Offices of Alien Property, who would seize some 200,000 or so documents. Present at this raid are also Tesla's nephew, whom he did not like at all, and was a suspected communist, Sava Kasanovich, and also someone described as being a hotel worker named Fitzgerald. The FBI would pass the boxes of documents off to John G. Trump, an MIT physicist and uncle to former President Donald Trump, as well as Navy intelligence, to go over. John Trump would write back after his review stating that he found no new sound working principle in the work that he had received and didn't mention anything about the death ray plans. The Navy would record the documents to microfilm, but they would allegedly later go missing. In the 1980s, a FOIA request would be answered saying that the Navy did in fact have his secret papers microfilmed at one time, but they never released any and none have ever surfaced since. So, with any good mystery, we need to identify possible suspects and examine motives. So let's just start there, shall we? Part 7. The suspects, and where did the death ray go? So, from what I've told you so far, you've probably already worked out that there are about 3 main players who could have potentially had the means and motivation to go after the plans for the death ray. Those would, of course, be the Soviets, the Nazis, and the US. So let's take a closer look at all 3, starting with the Soviets. Their obvious connections would be Kasanovich, if he truly was a communist. He was at least definitely, according again to the FBI, present at the safe's opening. They may have wanted to prevent him from selling the complete plans to a rival power, or simply wanted more complete plans that they never received for themselves. Next, let's look at what motivations the Nazis may have had. It's possible that they could have been tipped off by Viereck, or simply been spying on the US press. But by several FBI accounts, the Germans were interested in the potential of this new superweapon. They were at very least constantly seeking their next Wunderwaffe, or superweapon, to get a leg up on their enemies. Lastly, we have the good old US. They could have been, and likely were, enraged over him selling early plans to their Russian enemies. The FBI was absolutely watching Tesla very closely in his later years. While they outwardly seemed disinterested in the plans at first, or at least in funding Tesla to work on them, their interest would clearly grow as the threat of it falling into enemy hands increased. Now, let's take a look at any potential developments in these countries that could indicate that they did in fact possess the death ray plans. Starting with the Soviets. When the Cold War was reaching a fever pitch, blurry satellite photos of what appeared to be an obscure nuclear facility in Kazakhstan would become a hole where American intelligence analysts' worst fears and nightmares come home to roost, and became their near sole focus for some time. Many believed, some quite passionately, that the facility was the epicenter of Soviet efforts to develop particle beam weapons. Others thought that it was the site of nuclear experiments and the Soviets were trying to violate the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Still, some said it was home to a new type of missile. The US would name the facility, go ahead and swallow if you're drinking anything right now, P-Nuts, P-N-U-T-S, which stood for Potential or Possible Nuclear Underground Test Site. This would be the nucleus of the Star Wars program and supposedly what motivated the US to develop beam weapons and space-based lasers. At the fall of the Soviet Union, after decades of fear, the truth would begin to slowly come out though. And then it was proven in the 90s that the Soviets were in fact working on what was actually a new type of potential nuclear propulsion for the newest Soviet spacecraft in development at the time. No particle beams. At least not at that point. Next up is the Nazis. In 1945, details would emerge that the Nazis were working on a sun gun, while speculation ran wild that this was the deadly beam weapon in the style of Tesla's death ray they had all feared, until when the Allies would capture a base in Hillersleben in Germany However, the full plans would come out as the weapon was actually being mile-wide reflector-type satellite that would float in space and potentially direct amplified sun rays onto targets on the Earth. That really happened. The Nazis had plans to pull the old asshole burning ants with a magnifying glass trick on us with their proposed weapon. While utterly insane and frightening enough to consider it, it never came into fruition and was nothing at all like the Tesla death ray. Finally, we have to circle back to the US. If you recall, I mentioned a supposed hotel worker named Fitzgerald was present at the opening of Tesla's safe. No first name was provided. This just so happened to be the same last name, though, as one of Tesla's associates at the time of his death, Boyce Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was a scientist, said to be a brilliant mind. He was also a private in the US military at this time. Many have speculated, though it's impossible to prove, that these were in fact the same individual, and Boyce was simply disguised as a hotel worker, or only referred to as one by the FBI. One interesting parallel that would seem to indicate this could be the case at least, is that he would go on to develop particle beam weapons research, as well as working on other projects based on other Tesla weapon systems or other inventions that Tesla had been working on at the time of his death. He was frequently considered to be Tesla's protege and successor. If you didn't catch the Behind the Radio episode last season, where I first reported on the Maui fires, you can be forgiven at this point for thinking, wait, we have particle beam technology? Yes, we absolutely do have particle beam technology, folks. I posted many documents in support of the directed energy weapons, or the DEW programs, if you will, and that they exist. So examining the evidence presented, getting back to our story here, I ask you, who would have most likely had the means and the motivation to accomplish this? And, as always, it's important to ask, for bono, who benefits? As always, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm simply here to lay out all the evidence. I try to do that as accurately and truthfully as I possibly can, at least to the best of my ability, then allow you to decide for yourself. What I will say is that the further you dig, as with most stories I bring to you, the more you will find. There's a great deal more to the Fitzgerald story as well. But when I went to verify sources, I ran into tons of walls in my research. Official documents on his work during those years seemed to be very scant. Simply reading accounts on various websites here and there, that it doesn't warrant to me enough proof to be presenting it to you guys as fact. If you feel compelled to dig for yourself after you hear this, that is up to you. Just be careful, because as we may have just learned, some secrets are important enough to kill for. In the end, I just want to summarize a bit and go ahead and provide a smidge of context, and also remember Nikola Tesla. Please bear in mind, as long as this episode was, and the weeks of writing and research that you wouldn't believe that went into it, this was truly a very abbreviated story of Tesla's life and death. There was honestly hours more I could have gotten into, and I would love to have been able to include. I originally started this episode because I'd get my hands on an FBI document discussing his death and the death ray. I set out with the intention of bringing that story, to give you a good mystery to chew on, and to leave it at that, really. Tesla has always fascinated me, though, so I thought it would be a fun episode. As I began researching his life, I wanted to at least give you guys a brief intro into Tesla. I found myself kind of engulfed in the story of his life more than his eventual death. Such a brilliant, troubled, eccentric inventor, dealt tragedy after tragedy, as well as possibly being his own worst enemy throughout the whole time. I just felt compelled to tell you all of it. While I spoke in the beginning of all the things Tesla invented, a few anyway, and he did invent a lot of things, possibly a more accurate way to look at most of it would be to say that he improved upon others' ideas, and he had the ability to see what others missed or couldn't even imagine. Even so long after his death, history continues to prove Tesla more and more correct on so many of the outlandishly sounding concepts that he spoke about during his life. He was well ahead of his time. Tesla was an inventor, but he was also a dreamer, occasional fraudster, and once or twice a possible outright charlatan. A man whose inventions, or at least improvements upon others, would come to slowly revolutionize our world more and more. He was also a notorious self-mythicizer, with plenty of grandiose claims to muddy the water along the way. Above all, though, Tesla was a human being, brilliant and flawed, in equal measure, as plenty of us can be. We will likely never know the full extent of his life, death, or legacy, and I have to believe that he wouldn't have had it any other way. Regardless of the full truth of Tesla's life or death, he was a spark that made our world a little bit brighter. And for that, I just want to say thank you to Tesla. And thank you, as always, for joining me for this journey across time in the life of Nikola Tesla. I'll be back with you guys this coming Wednesday for BTR. We might talk a little bit more about all of this. I'll share some more thoughts and insights and probably get back to doing a little bit of news this week. But until then, I ask you to stay curious. And I'll talk to you again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio Podcast.